While there are great maps in the 20-year history of the Battlefield franchise, there are also others that are dramatically imbalanced, poorly laid out, or simply disasters of design. This is the story of the worst maps of Battlefield. Gather round, ye children, as Old Man Gravity will now tell you the tale of Berlin. This is a story that can only be told and not shown, as the true nature of the map and its original gameplay lie buried in the past, where almost no original multiplayer footage survives. Only mere seconds of this video reflect the described vanilla layout, as its true form has been rarely played for decades. No doubt there are Battlefield 1942 fans of this map, past and present here, some of which are probably already writing comments about how wrong I am. Bear with me, my noble companions, your concerns and your love of this map will be justified. For here and now we must go back to one of the original Battlefield 1942 maps, in its unaltered, unmodded, and truly insane form. Welcome to Berlin, a three-flag conquest assault map set in the heart of the German capital in the final hours of the war in Europe. Incredibly, Berlin is one of the smallest Battlefield maps ever created with the intention of being a 64-player map. Based purely on playable terrain, it is smaller than Fiel, Rotterdam, Omaha Beach, Amiens, Argonne, Locker, even Operation Metro. In fact, only the close quarters maps of Battlefield 3 are comparable. Berlin's size, however, is not the root cause of its troubles. It simply accentuates frustrating gameplay elements. The RU opening design is far and away its biggest sin. Berlin begins with 3 German flags and the single Soviet flag to the north, with its uncapturable icon denoting a conquest assault style map. This lone Russian deployment flag is where all pain on this map is centered. The Russian flag is placed at the top of a very small street, and protected by some barbed wire, a single line of sandbags, and some mounted MG-42s. Not 10 meters in front of the flag are 2 Russian tank spawns, 1 medium and 1 heavy, which spawn alongside a half-track, all just a few meters away from the edge of the street corner. These tanks actually spawn a lengthy walking distance away from most of the Russian spawn locations, and this can have disastrous effects. Compounding the tank distances are the Russian spawn points, nearly all of which are located near the flag behind the sandbags and tank traps, in clear view of snipers and wide open to eating grenades thrown by Germans. These spawn locations, coupled with this single street opening, made Berlin one of the most campy meat grinders in Battlefield series history. Permitting this critical failure of map design in the first place is the location of German flag number 1, Brunnenstrasse HQ, the northeast German flag. A small flag radius, this point is notable for how close it is to the Russian main. It takes, on average, less than 4 seconds for German players who spawn on this point to have a line of sight into the Russian main, meaning grenades can be thrown and detonate soon after. Several German players, knowing about the Russian armor, would spawn as anti-tank, and assuming that the Russian players made it to the tanks and off the starting positions in the first place, would zook them from the front or from the more vulnerable sides and rear as they push forward. Most of the time, the number of anti-tank rockets needed was minimal, as this was Battlefield 1942, and the grenade spam and damage of those grenades was incredible. Grenades have a huge blast radius and do significant damage even to tanks. Even the heavy tank could be crippled almost immediately on round start. Remember also that each class except the engineer, even anti-tank, got 3 of these grenades each. Now imagine most of 2 32-player teams spawning and spamming grenades down this street immediately. Thankfully, this wasn't the only route the Russians had to break out. No, of course there had to be a secondary path. No dev would be that cruel. It's located right here. Yeah, this is the only other way out of the Russian main. A back street from behind the flag loops into this alleyway, extending into a lengthy straight before narrowing and turning into that bottleneck. Could you even imagine trying to jam your way through this? Imagine the grenade spam and the explosive packs waiting for players at the exit. Most of the time, nothing ever made it out alive. The exit also sits directly opposite of the closest German flag, meaning a never-ending stream of German players were always here, many of whom were already camping the main street. Pushing out into them could mean fighting more than a dozen players simultaneously. But you know something? This can get even better. This whole Russian area of the map had no map border or uncapped protection. German players, bored of throwing grenades, could make their own push into the alley where, get this, a 3-story building with windows aimed directly down the alley was positioned just before the exit. German players could get up in this building and lob grenades down the alley, snipe, shoot, plant dynamite even further up, and make this straightaway an unbreakable killing field. Moreover, this did not stop bloodthirsty German players from pushing up the alley, using the few barrels or boxes for cover, and literally camping some of the Russian main spawn locations just around the corner. The 3-story building at the alley's end also had open windows to the main street behind. So, while the bottleneck was not the only option here, between fall damage and grenade spam and the swarm of German players on the street, jumping out here was a fool's errand. What could be beneficial during all of this was using the windows to chuck your own explosives through and kill enough Germans to possibly break out. 90% of gameplay on Berlin saw the vast majority of 64 players jammed into this tiny zone. Germans camped on the northern street in huge numbers, spamming grenades and overwhelming Russians trying to escape the main road. Russians were caught in the German crossfire from the right and left. Meanwhile, aggressive German pushes into the alleyway were constant. The buildings at the end of the street did no favors either. On the right side of the street looking down from the Russian main is a 3-story building on the corner, which did provide excellent defensive cover for the German team. While the windows could only view the alleyway exit and a fraction of the main road, they still could be used for tossing explosive packs down. Most frequently, it was the first floor corner which saw the most action, as Russian players passing by were either distracted here or shot in the back from multiple angles. Additionally, a damaged building in the center had a gap in its boarded-up window, allowing for the perfect sniper cover of the street. The limited pathing options and small scale, not to mention the close proximity of these two flags, made Berlin legendary for its grenade spam. The Russian team actually has an ammo box placed just behind their sandbag wall. With the incredible speed of explosive reloads, grenades could be thrown indefinitely from the Russian side. This, of course, frequently resulted in whole groups of Russian players prone behind the wall spamming them, while a single, well-placed German grenade could kill them all. Whole chunks of teams, sometimes 10 bodies at a time, could be seen flying from the explosions. When combined with Battlefield 1942's notoriously strong and plentiful grenades, this was a recipe for disaster. The main base contain and spawn camping of the Russian team was frequent, expected, and often overwhelming. And yet, the totality of this meat grinder isn't complete. Remember those Russian tanks? Their positioning a good bit from the main spawns, and well, closer to the street corners than the flag itself, made them vulnerable assets which could be stolen by German players. All it took was a few well-placed grenades, or a full wave of them, and careful awareness of the respawn timer, and those tanks were as good as in German hands. Thus, the complete insanity of Berlin is obvious, and we haven't even talked about the rest of the map yet. Did I mention that the German team actually gets a tank of their own? They do! It spawns down at the bottom left flag, the Bernauer Strasse HQ, and it only takes a matter of seconds to drive up to the Campfest. But normally this tank would keep its distance, since it's dangerous to get so close to so many enemy players. Instead, well-angled shots down the main road help further devastate the Russian team. In essence, a standard experience of the Russian team is to be spawn camped immediately, grenade spammed all round, shelled by the German tank, potentially have their own tank stolen and used against them, and forced into a meat grinder with only 2 ways out. But what about the rest of the map? Well, the remaining 90% of Berlin consists of destroyed buildings, rubble piles, and a limited amount of enterable structures ranging from hollowed out spaces to 3-story apartments with windows. All of these buildings are tightly clustered together with the open street layout surrounding them. The streets, although largely empty and ripe for easy grenade kills, have a limited draw distance thanks to the dusty haze which covers the map. On some street corners you can find a mounted MG42, and one in particular which can be spammed down the main street toward the Russian main. As for the 3 German flags, it should be said that as far as 1942 capture points go, they are really good. Each of them is surrounded by limited cover and numerous ruined buildings. Multiple pathing options make for plenty of flanking routes and firing angles, as well as making capturing the flags slightly difficult. Berlin's only other negative ended up being its minuscule size. If the Russian team broke out, and that was a big if, they were usually never contained again. But the vast amounts of enemies roaming the streets together on either team resulted in frequent spawn camping around the objectives and meat grinders around these zones, especially when the Germans were brought down to a single flag for survival. Paradoxically, despite still being prone to copious amounts of grenade spam, the rest of Berlin actually turns into an incredibly well-balanced, enjoyable, and intense infantry map with just enough space to move. And thus, we come to a more modern, smarter version of Berlin, one changed by custom map layouts and server settings over time. Within the first 2 years of BF 1942's release, knowledge of server setting capabilities became widespread, and communities took full advantage. Berlin soon became an infantry-only staple. The tanks and the APCs were completely removed, and more importantly, all explosives, aside from the use of bazookas, became impossible. With these changes, Berlin went from base camping nightmare to one of the best maps of Battlefield 1942. Exclusive Berlin-only servers became flooded with infantry-dominant players, and competitive North American players could be found in very sweaty servers of Cookies and Oreos or Ghetto Berlin, practicing against the very best and warming up for competitive matches. Further server-side changes would result in expanding the borders of the map, adding custom sections, altering the German flag positions, and adding additional cover. Berlin, both in its heyday and in the present, also became famous for its team deathmatch capability and its capture the flag popularity. In fact, for many years now, servers have preferred to run these other game modes instead of the pain of the default Conquest version. Berlin was also famous for one particularly awesome Battlefield community meme, and that is F5. In the quadrant of F5 on the Berlin map, there is a tiny corner of the terrain seemingly isolated and lonely. Players could camp here with snipers, but it was really known by dedicated players as the spot where knife fights exclusively took place. And in dedicated servers, like some unwritten gentleman's agreement, If you saw a player running toward F5 with their knife out, then you left them the hell alone as they went on their way to the Fight Club. This corner for knife fights is ingrained in my memory, as is the unusual and truly remarkable way that most of the 1942 community honored this custom. Battlefield 1942's Berlin is incredibly nostalgic, but players of the game's original era had two very different experiences. For some, a heavily modded and optimized version which extended map boundaries and curtailed its vices, while others were forced to play the original shipped version with its confined RU spawn and built-in choke points, horribly placed spawn locations, and unfettered grenade spam, making such a tiny map almost unbearable. It was a spawn camp of epic proportions, and can definitely be considered the series' first true meat grinder. Berlin's failure comes entirely from this default layout and game mechanics, but when altered by the community, it turned out to be one of the best infantry-only maps of the Refractor engine era. Without the efforts of the community to rectify this debacle, the original Berlin earns it a spot on the worst maps of Battlefield.